We will continue looking at exception handling, but this time taking another approach. Sometimes it's simpler to avoid errors by limiting the choices presented to the user. At times you can save errors or even additional error checking by limiting the choices that you give the user. This can be done through disabling or graying out certain options. In this example, the user will be allowed to enter a test score, click on the Add Score button, and then click on the Calculate Average button. Before running this, let's take a look at the code so we have a feel for the design. You'll notice there are two module level variables, total score decimal and number of tests integer. These two variables are necessary because to calculate the average we need those two items. We need to be able to divide the total score by the number of tests. This will be placed in a local variable called average decimal, which is declared within the Calculate Average button procedure. Once that calculation has been determined, we will then display that average in a very simple message box. Prior to that, however, the user will click the Add button. In the Add button, the variable test score decimal will be converted from the text box to an integer and placed into the variable. Then the calculation will be to accumulate the test scores into the total score variable, and then finally we'll need to add the number of tests integer, that is to add 1 each time the user clicks the Add button. That is going to represent our number of tests. So let's run the program as it stands at this point. And if I enter a number such as 90 and click Add Score, and then enter 80 and Add Score, and then Calculate Average, you can see it correctly displays the average of 85 in my message box. So as long as the user does exactly what we expect them to do, there will not be a problem. However, that is not always the case. So stopping the program and returning to the form, let's run the program once more, but this time instead of entering a test score, what if I simply by accident click Calculate Average first? Doing so creates a runtime error that is being displayed by the Visual Studio environment. As you can see, it immediately puts us into debugging mode, and we are now in a runtime error which says divide by 0 exception. And the offending line is the line where the calculation is taking place, where the total score is being divided by the number of tests. Now remember, we got here by clicking the Average button without first clicking the Add button, which resulted in the number of tests never being added. So therefore our number of tests integer by default is still 0, thus creating the division by 0 error. Now obviously we want to create a scenario where this can be avoided. A very simple way to avoid this type of error is to focus on the fact that the Calculate Average button doesn't really belong visible or available to the user until the user has processed at least one score. So therefore a very simple way to solve this is to make the Calculate Average button invisible upon startup. That is, over in the Properties window for Calculate Average, change the visible property to false. Even though we still see it at design time, when we run the program it will not be visible initially. Now, if we want to make it visible after we process at least one test score, we need to revisit our Add button click procedure, and we'll add a line of code that will cause the Calculate Average button to become visible by setting the visible property to true. Now keep in mind, this is only going to occur once the user has processed at least one score. So we'll now run this version, and notice that the Calculate Average button is not even visible to the user. So therefore it is impossible for them to click on it, therefore impossible to create the division by 0. So if I enter 90, as soon as I click the add score once, the calculate average button appears, and now I can continue with the rest of my data. And once I enter the sufficient number of scores, I click calculate, and as you can see, the correct average is displayed. So again, sometimes the simple approach is the best approach, is that if you don't want the user to have the option until a certain condition appears or presents itself, one way is to simply make the button, in this case, not visible. An alternative to that approach is to, instead of using the visible property, which I'll reset to true, I could use the enabled property for the calculate average button. So going to the properties window, I will change the enabled property to false. Once again, it looks perfectly normal on our form, but at runtime you will see the difference. Before we run the program, we will need to change our code. Instead of the visible property, we will want the enabled property to be set to true when the user has clicked the add button at least once. So now let's compare the run of this program. Here you notice the button is visible to the user, so they know that's going to be an option eventually, but they cannot click on it until they have processed at least one number, and now it becomes enabled to them. And again, the program behaves normally from that point forward.